Hello and welcome to the next episode of my Learn With Me Hydrasynth series. This is episode 14, Effects, Part 1. So first, what is Learn With Me? Learn With Me is a series where you follow my process going end to end, learning to get the best from a synthesizer. In this case, it is the ASM Sound Machine's Hydrasynth Explorer. This is part of a family of 4 synthesizers which share the same sound engine. That is the Hydrasynth, the original, the Hydrasynth Desktop, the Hydrasynth Explorer, and the Hydrasynth Deluxe. The only difference sound engine-wise is the Hydrasynth Deluxe has 2 instances of the engine, so meaning double the voice count or splits and layers. They have differing controls, but barring the desktop, they all have keyboards. The Explorer has the shortest keybed with a 37 mini keybed, but they all also have polyphonic aftertouch. So far I've talked about the build quality, I've experimented with some presets, we've talked about the general signal flow, and we've looked in detail at each of the sections or modules as they call them, and we have reached the effects section, which is the end of the signal path, and that is what we'll be looking at today. Now, looking at the signal flow, you may think, well, pre-effects is the obvious place to go. But pre-effects and post-effects are similar, and I think delay and reverb are more readily understood. So I'm going to talk today about the delay and reverb. So let's first get ourselves in a knit patch. Let's make ourselves a quick sound. Let's see. 4 seconds, 2 seconds. So then this one can be 3 seconds, 1.5 seconds. So I'm not really describing the sound that I'm making. This is not a particularly important process. I was thinking maybe we can use the low pass gate filter type here. Let's close this filter up a bit. Let's add some filter motion. Add some velocity sensitivity to both velocity and to both amplitude and filter. Maybe I'll change the waveform. Okay, works reasonably well here, I think. Maybe I would like that to be a little bit more aggressive there. Okay, I think that works. So let's dive into the effects. So let's look at the parameters. First is type. There are several types of delay available, which I will describe. We have an ability to adjust the tone of the wet signal and the feedback signal. And we have a possibility of BPM sync. So BPM sync means that the time, that is the interval that is being repeated for the delay, can be set to a beats per minute rather than a time. The wet tone is setting how bright or dark the wet signal, which is the effect part of it, is being. I suppose I should probably say that if you look at the signal flow, it runs through these effects in order. So these are all insert effects, and they are not send effects. So they don't run in parallel, they run in series. So this is setting the tone of the wet signal. So let's go to 100% wet. So we're only listening to the delay. So notice when I hit the key, you don't hear anything because the dry signal is not coming through. Let's turn wet all the way to maximum. So you'll hear that it's high pass filtered it. Turn it all the way to minimum. It's low pass filtered it. And there's a similar sort of tonal adjustment based on the feed's tone. So we have a time, which is the length of the delay period. So in this case, it is 1/4 of a second. In other words, 4 repeats per second will occur. Let's make it a little slower, about 33. So about 3 repeats per second will occur. Feedback amount, that is how much of the recorded signal goes back in and gets added again, which will indicate how long it will take to fade away. And wet dry is how much of the original signal, this is all dry, only the original signal, which is the default mode that these are in because we want them to pass through the audio unaffected. And this is 100% wet that we already heard. So just the delay, this is the default type called a basic monophonic. Turn that up a bit. I think I've maybe got this tone a little bit too wet, too dark. So I think that sounds pretty interesting, but let's see where else we can go with this. So the next option is basic st for stereo. So what this means is, in the former case, irrespective of the stereo panning of the oscillators and the voice, the signal being received by the delay would be monophonic. Now the stereophonic original signal would be the dry signal, but the wet signal would always be monophonic or center panned. So it didn't matter what stereo position anything else had. If I make the stereo width wide, we should be able to hear this fairly clearly. So this is monophonic. So hopefully you can hear that the echoes of the delay are in the middle of the stereo spectrum. Now let's try stereo. So hopefully you can hear then that the echoes follow the panning of the voices there. So I think that's a pretty nice thing to be able to do. Sometimes you don't have the capacity to select that. Next type is panning delay. So this is what you think of as a ping pong delay. So what that means is the signal is going to be sent to a buffer on one side, which is then feeding the buffer on the other side. So what you're going to hear then is your audio is going to be wherever it was in the stereo spectrum, and the echoes are going to ping pong. So let's have a go with that. So a little bit more spatial. It has another delay type, which is, I guess, a pretty interesting one, LRC. So instead of ping pong, which has these buffers either side, this has a left, a right, and then a center. So the echo is going to go left, right, center. Interesting motion. And finally, we have reverse. So what reverse is going to do is the buffer is going to be played back from reverse order. So this is going to give us something which sounds a little unusual, but can be quite interesting for various purposes. Hopefully you can hear the sort of pulling sound that has. Let me... Pretty interesting, I would say. So that's all of the reverb types. Let's go for basic stereo, but I'm going to turn the wet dry mix all the way to dry because we're going to look at reverb. I think this is quite interesting. I think there are enough options that you're not going to get too bored. It would be nice if it went a little further. Another thing I would like is if there were, say, 4 arbitrary effect slots. As it is, there are specific slots with specific effect types. And I know this makes sense and it simplifies things, but I think there would be more opportunity for complex sound design if the effects were more flexibly routed or could be more flexibly ordered. I know, for example, the DeepMind 12 has a number of effect slots. Each of one can hold any of the effects, so you can do some pretty interesting things there. In any case, let's have a look at reverb. So reverb, just like delay, has a number of types available. We have pre-delay, which is how long before the reverb echo starts coming back to us. Time is how long the reverb tail is going to be. Wet dry is how much of the wet signal, being the reverb sound, and the dry signal, being the original sound, will be audible. Tone is setting the brightness or darkness of the reverb on the whole, and high damp and low damp allow us to specify how much of that reverberation impacts the high end or the low end. So by default, the high damp is set relatively high, which means instead of a super bright, almost metallic sounding reverb, we're going to get something which is kept a little bit darker. So let's, for an example, let's listen to 100% wet. Now let's turn the high damping all the way down, turn it all the way up, turn low damping all the way up, high damping all the way down. So hopefully you can hear there is some timbral difference there, but beyond these damping settings, there is this tone setting, which has a more notable effect. Let's try this in the middle and let's try that process again. High damp maximum, high damp minimum, low damp maximum, low damp minimum, back to the default, tone maximum, tone minimum, you can hear there's a timbral shift that is available to us based on this tone parameter. Let's listen to the other reverb types. Oh, let's try a very long pre-delay just as an example. So you can hear a quarter of a second before that reverb comes back. So that's supposed to reflect the room being very big. There's a long way to the walls. So then it takes the sound time to reach the walls and come back to us. So a 250 milliseconds pre-delay, if I remember correctly, there's about 3 milliseconds per meter of travel in air. So that's roughly 370. So it's probably a 35, so a 70 meter square room would be, as in 70 meters on each axis, would be the size of a room for that much. So that would be a pretty gigantic space. One of the things you may be interested in, it's possible potentially to modulate this, and in the same way that's possible for the delay, and I think that's one of the ways we can add a bit of character. We can also adjust the time. So though the time is not by default a parameter with a built-in modulation, we could use an LFO to modulate it. So let's test this at a very long, there's freeze as a maximum. So this is a 58 seconds delay tail. So this delay tail is going to carry on for a very long time. We can set it to freeze, which means it's actually an unending delay. Something more practical. 5 seconds is maybe a little more practical. I'm going to turn the level down here. Let's turn the wet dry down until that sounds like something more sensible. Try and adjust the tone. So that's put a little bit of space around what we're hearing. Let's go back and listen to the other algorithm type. So that's a hall. So hall is supposed to represent a big, tall, wide space. So it's supposed to be three-dimensionally large. Room is an algorithm designed for simulating a smaller room. That's to say the expectation is a lower ceiling and lower walls versus the hall having high ceiling. So I think you can hear a difference in how much of the reverb is audible later in the delay tail. So in the hall, I think the amplitude of the delays, the reverb stays larger, and in the room, it gets smaller quicker, but it still lasts the full length. Next is plate. plate is a synthetic but physical reverb where you transmit the audio through a large metal plate using some transducers, and you pick up the signal back from it. So you're vibrating a plate. Let's listen. A bit more wet. So this has a bit of a distinctive metallic ring. It's not like a spring reverb, which is very springy and metallic, but it's a little bit more towards a spring than a hall is. So this one is called Cloud, and I'm picking up a hint of like almost a delay in it. I think the name is maybe hinting that it's granular, but it has an interesting character. So let's try and bring in both the delay and the reverb. Let's listen to what it sounds like if we modulate the time of the delay a little. Quite an interesting motion. So let's say, what if we set the LFO to be free running, and we set it quite slow, and we used it to modulate the delay time. Too much. So when the delay time is expanded or contracted, typically the recording media is a fixed length and you're playing it faster or slower. So what changing the delay time does is it plays back the recorded audio faster or slower, so we're getting pitch shifting, which I think is pretty interesting. Maybe let's try and modulate the time also. So the reason, by the way, that I set this to free running rather than polyphonic is I didn't particularly want to hear the LFO resetting, because a discontinuity in that modulation is going to cause a glitch in the audio, which is not what I wanted, but it may be what you want for various purposes. So let's see. Set this even longer. So reverb time. Okay, so we have a little bit of modulation going on here. And I think that's about all I wanted to say about the delay and the reverb. In the next episode, we'll talk about pre-effect and post-effects, which brings us to the end of our discussion of the signal chain. We have a couple more things to look at, but broadly, we're done with the features. Once we look at these last couple of things, we'll be on to the sound design part of this series. So let me play a little bit, maybe down an octave. And so I think very simple sound coming in. Those little modulations made a difference. Once we bring the other effects in, and maybe once we do some more creative modulation, I think the effects section can definitely be an asset for us sound design wise here. In any case, I hope you've been enjoying the series. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you'll join me for some more episodes, but most importantly, I'd like to say thank you very much for joining me today, and goodbye.